For days, Rex refused to eat. He just sat by the gate, staring at the empty road. Jack, his owner, thought it was old age. But when he checked the security cameras, what he saw changed everything. Why was a retired police dog acting this way? And what secret was buried in their past? This story will break your heart, but in the end it will remind you of the incredible loyalty of a dog. Stay with us to uncover the truth. The sun hung low over the quiet town of Rockford, Texas, casting long golden shadows across the empty streets. The town was the kind of place where people knew each other by name, where life moved at a steady, predictable pace. But within a small, worn-down house at the edge of town, something wasn't right. Jack Callahan, a retired police officer in his late 50s, stood in the kitchen, staring at a full dog bowl that had remained untouched for the third day in a row. Jack was a man built from years of discipline and hardship. His frame was broad, his hands rough from decades of police work, and his greying hair sat in disheveled waves over a lined, weathered face. His blue eyes, once sharp with the instincts of a seasoned officer, now carried the weight of quiet solitude. Since his retirement, life had slowed down, and the only company he had left was Rex. Rex wasn't just any dog. He was a German shepherd, 12 years old, his black and tan coat now tinged with silver. He had the look of a veteran, strong, proud, yet marked by the passage of time. His once alert ears drooped slightly, and a thin scar ran along his right flank, a reminder of the many dangerous missions he had been part of. But what concerned Jack the most wasn't Rex's age or appearance. It was his behavior. For days now, Rex had refused to eat. He would sit by the front gate, staring out onto the street, as if waiting for someone who would never come. His once lively brown eyes had dulled, filled with a sorrow Jack couldn't understand. The bond between man and dog was deep, forged through years of working together in the K9 unit, chasing down criminals, finding missing people, and saving lives. Jack had seen Rex at his strongest, relentless, fearless. But now, for the first time, he saw something he had never expected from his old partner. Loss. Jack sighed, kneeling beside Rex. He ran a calloused hand over the dog's thick fur, feeling the slow rise and fall of his chest. "Come on, buddy. You gotta eat," he said softly, but Rex barely blinked. He just kept staring at the road. Frustration crept into Jack's voice. "What is it, huh? What are you looking for?" Of course, there was no answer. The trip to the vet. Jack wasn't the kind of man who panicked easily, but this situation gnawed at him. The next morning, he loaded Rex into his old red Ford F-150, the truck rattling to life as they drove into town. The Rockford Veterinary Clinic was run by Dr. Emily Carter, a woman in her early 40s with a no-nonsense attitude and a heart that had seen too much grief. She was tall and lean, her auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail, and her sharp green eyes had the ability to see right through any lie, useful in a town where people often tried to downplay their pets' health issues. Emily had known Jack for years. Back when he was still a cop, she was the one who stitched Rex up after a particularly nasty altercation with a knife-wielding suspect. She respected Jack, not just as a former officer, but as someone who truly cared for his dog. Jack carried Rex inside, his large frame making it easy to lift the German shepherd, though it was a reminder that Rex no longer had the strength he once did. Setting him on the examination table, Jack crossed his arms as Emily started her routine check. "Not eating for how many days?" she asked, her voice steady but concerned. "3," Jack replied, "maybe 4. He won't even touch his favorite food." Emily hummed thoughtfully, running her hands gently over Rex's body, feeling for abnormalities. She checked his teeth, his ears, listened to his heart. Nothing unusual. "Weight's dropped a little, but not dangerously yet," she murmured. "No fever, no infections, heart sounds good. Honestly, Jack, physically he's fine." Jack clenched his jaw. "Then why the hell won't he eat?" Emily exhaled, leaning against the table. "Sometimes, when older dogs stop eating, it's not about their body, It's their mind. Has anything changed recently? A new environment, a new routine? Jack shook his head. No. Same house, same walks, same damn truck. He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. But he's been off. He keeps sitting at the front gate, just staring, like he's waiting for someone. Emily's expression softened. Jack, dogs grieve too. He's getting old, and he's had a long career. Maybe someone is on his mind. Jack scoffed, but the words hit deeper than he wanted to admit. He's not some fragile pet. He's a damn warrior. Emily smiled, but it was laced with sadness. Even warriors get tired, Jack. Jack looked down at Rex, who lay still on the table, his deep brown eyes reflecting something Jack couldn't quite place. Not fear, not pain, but longing. Back home. Driving back, Jack kept glancing at Rex in the rearview mirror. He had barely moved since they left the clinic, his head resting on his paws. The diagnosis wasn't much of a diagnosis at all. There was nothing wrong with him physically, yet something inside him was broken. Back at the house, Jack opened the truck door, expecting Rex to hop out like usual. But the dog just lay there, unmoving. With a heavy sigh, Jack lifted him again, carrying him up the porch steps and setting him gently on his favorite spot by the door. For the rest of the evening, Jack tried everything. Cooked steak, fresh chicken, nothing. Rex simply turned his head away. The clock ticked toward midnight. Jack sat in his old recliner, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching the dog who had once been his unbreakable partner, now fading before his eyes. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Rex move. Slowly, painfully, the German shepherd pushed himself up and limped to the front gate. He sat down, ears twitching, eyes locked on the empty street. Jack's stomach tightened. This wasn't just old age. This was something else. The night had settled heavily over Rockford, Texas, the warm breeze barely rustling the leaves in Jack's yard. Inside the house, the dim glow of a single lamp cast long shadows over the walls as Jack sat at the old wooden desk in his study, rubbing his temples. The house was silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional sigh from Rex, who lay curled up near the door. Jack's thoughts were heavy, circling the same question over and over. What was wrong with his old partner? Jack had never been a man to ignore a problem, and this was no different. Something was off. And if there was one thing his years as a cop had taught him, it was that things never just happened without a reason. He had spent his entire career piecing together puzzles, uncovering the truth beneath layers of silence. This time, the mystery wasn't about a case or a suspect. It was about Rex. He stood, stretching his tired limbs, and walked over to the security monitor mounted in the corner of the room. The cameras covered the front gate, backyard, and driveway, though in a town like Rockford, crime was rare. He barely checked the footage anymore. There was never much to see, but tonight something told him he needed to look. He clicked through the recorded footage, skipping past the daylight hours where nothing seemed unusual. It was the night footage that mattered. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he sped through the timeline, stopping at midnight. The black and white footage flickered for a moment before stabilizing, showing the front gate. And there was Rex, sitting motionless, eyes locked on the empty road beyond. Jack frowned. He scrubbed backward and replayed it. Rex had been sitting there for hours, barely moving, his ears twitching every now and then. It wasn't just restlessness. He was waiting. Jack fast-forwarded to the next night's footage. The same thing. Rex, again at the exact same spot, at the exact same time, staring out into the night. Jack felt a prickle of unease creep up his spine. He checked the third night. Same behavior. "What the hell are you looking at, boy?" Jack muttered under his breath. Then something else caught his attention. At 2:47 a.m., Rex suddenly stood up, his ears perked. He shifted slightly, his nose flaring, and then he let out a low growl. Jack squinted at the grainy footage, his pulse quickening. The streetlights barely illuminated the road, But in the distance, just past the edge of the camera's reach, something moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A figure, tall, lingering at the far end of the street, barely visible in the poor lighting. They weren't walking, not passing by like a late-night jogger. They were standing still, watching. Jack rewound and played it again, this time slower. The person had been there for several minutes before Rex reacted. Then, as soon as the dog growled, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Jack exhaled sharply, his instincts kicking in. This wasn't random. Rex wasn't just staring at nothing. He had sensed someone who had been watching his house. Jack clenched his jaw. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but the idea of a stranger lurking around his property, night after night, didn't sit well with him. His gut told him this wasn't some drunk wandering home or a kid playing pranks. Whoever this was, they were deliberate. He turned from the screen and glanced at Rex, who had lifted his head slightly, ears twitching as if he knew his owner had just discovered something. Jack's mind was already moving. Who would be watching him? He had left the force years ago, but enemies didn't just disappear. His job had put plenty of bad men behind bars. Could this be related to one of his old cases, or was this about Rex? Jack knew firsthand how valuable a canine dog could be. Rex had been in the thick of it for years, tracking criminals, taking down suspects. Was there someone out there with a grudge against him? His hands balled into fists. He wasn't about to sit around and let some unknown figure haunt his nights. He needed more information. A late-night drive. Jack grabbed his keys and jacket, then whistled for Rex. The German Shepherd slowly got up, shaking his coat before padding over. Jack wasn't sure if he had the strength he once did, but Rex had always been sharp. If something was wrong out there, the dog would know. He stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against his skin. The street was quiet, the town asleep, but now the silence felt different, unnerving. He scanned the area before unlocking his truck. "Come on, boy," he murmured, and Rex hopped into the passenger seat, settling down as Jack started the engine. The truck rumbled to life, and Jack pulled away from his driveway, heading down the road where he had seen the figure standing. He drove slow, eyes scanning the shadows, looking for any sign of movement. Rex sat alert beside him, ears flicking, his nose twitching at the night air. They passed a few houses, each dark with their owners fast asleep. The town was quiet, but Jack could feel something beneath the surface, something just out of reach. He reached the spot where the person had been standing. He pulled over, turning off the headlights. He sat there for a moment, letting the stillness settle around him. Rex shifted in the seat, his body tense. Jack opened the door and stepped out, walking a few paces down the street. He crouched low, pressing his fingers into the soft dirt near the sidewalk. Something had disturbed the ground recently. Footprints. Jack narrowed his eyes. The prints were deep, heavier than a casual step. Whoever it was had stood here for a while. A familiar feeling settled into Jack's gut. He had spent years tracking people down, and this wasn't coincidence. This was someone waiting, watching. His jaw tightened. Whoever it was, they'd be back. Jack stood, brushing the dirt off his hands. He turned back to the truck where Rex sat watching him. "You knew, didn't you, buddy?" Jack muttered. Rex didn't move, just stared ahead, as if he was still waiting for something Jack hadn't seen yet. Jack took a deep breath. He had a feeling this was only the beginning. The past had a way of creeping up when least expected, slipping into the cracks of a restless mind and refusing to leave. Jack had spent years building walls against memories that threatened to drag him under, but tonight, as he sat on the worn couch with Rex lying at his feet, the past found its way through. The security footage, the lurking figure, Rex's strange behavior, it all brought him back to a time when everything was clearer, yet infinitely more dangerous. 2 years ago, a different life, a different Jack. Jack had never been the kind of cop who took the easy assignments. He thrived on the adrenaline of high-stakes situations, the rush of the chase, the satisfaction of bringing justice to those who thought they could escape it. And through it all, Rex had been by his side, his partner, his shield, his most loyal companion. Rex wasn't just another K9 officer, he was exceptional, a dog with instincts sharper than most humans Jack had worked with. They had taken down criminals, sniffed out drugs hidden in impossible places, tracked missing persons who had been given up for dead. But none of that compared to the night everything changed. It had been one of the worst nights of Jack's life. The city was shrouded in the humid weight of a summer storm, the sky thick with thunderclouds, the air electric with tension. Ryan Carter, Jack's longtime partner and closest friend, had been driving that night. Ryan was the kind of cop people respected, not just for his skill, but for the kind of man he was. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and piercing brown eyes, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent years facing down the worst the world had to offer. He was fair but firm, never one to lose his temper, always the first to step in when a situation turned south. But more than that, he had been Jack's brother in arms. They had been chasing down a suspected drug trafficker, a man named Luis Ortega, who had been running operations up and down the Texas border. The guy was slick, dangerous, the kind who never got his hands dirty but left a trail of bodies in his wake. That night, an informant had tipped them off that Ortega was meeting someone in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The setup had felt wrong from the start. The warehouse was too quiet, the air inside thick with the scent of oil and dust. Jack remembered the way Rex had bristled, the low rumble in his chest, the way his ears had flattened against his head in warning. But there was no turning back, not when they were this close. Jack and Ryan had moved in cautiously, guns drawn, Rex leading the way with his nose to the ground. Then the first shot rang out. The echo of gunfire ripped through the metal walls, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Jack dropped to the ground as a second shot whizzed past him, embedding itself into a stack of wooden crates. His heart pounded in his ears, his mind already calculating their next move. And then he heard it, a strangled gasp. He turned just in time to see Ryan stagger backward, his body jerking as the bullet tore through his chest. Blood bloomed across his uniform, dark and spreading, and for the first time in his life, Jack felt true, paralyzing fear. "Ryan!" His voice had been raw, desperate. Ryan crumpled to the ground, gasping, one hand clutching his chest. Jack didn't think. He just moved. He dropped his weapon, pressing his hands to the wound, trying to stop the blood that was pouring too fast, too much. Rex was beside them, barking wildly, his body tense, his eyes darting between Ryan and the shadows beyond. But the gunman was still there. Before Jack could react, Ortega stepped out from the darkness, a cruel smile stretching across his face. Slim, sharp-eyed, with a scar running down his right cheek, Ortega had the look of a man who had spent his entire life knowing he was untouchable. He didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, gun in hand, watching as Ryan bled out on the floor. Jack had never wanted to kill a man more in his life. But before he could move, Rex did. With a snarl that shook the room, the German shepherd launched himself at Ortega. Jack barely had time to register the blur of movement before Rex's powerful jaws clamped down on the man's wrist. Ortega let out a howl of pain, his gun clattering to the ground. But even as Rex tore into him, Jack knew he had to make a choice. Stay and fight, or get Ryan out. It wasn't a choice at all. Jack grabbed Ryan under the arms, dragging him toward the exit as Rex continued to hold Ortega down. But the moment they reached the door, the sound of another gunshot split the air. Rex yelped, his body jerking, but he didn't let go. Blood stained his fur, but he refused to release Ortega until Jack shouted his name. "Rex, let's go!" Rex hesitated just for a second before finally obeying, limping toward Jack as they escaped into the night. The next few hours were a blur of sirens, rushing paramedics, and blood-streaked hands. Ortega had disappeared, slipping through the cracks like a ghost, but at that moment, Jack didn't care. The only thing that mattered was Ryan. But Ryan didn't make it. The bullet had torn through his lung, and by the time they reached the hospital, there was nothing the doctors could do. Jack had stood in that sterile white hallway, his hands still stained with his best friend's blood, feeling completely, utterly helpless. And Rex had never been the same. The wound on his side had healed, but something inside him had broken that night. He had sat by the door for weeks, waiting for Ryan to come back. Jack had tried everything: extra training, long walks, new routines, but nothing could erase the moment Rex had watched his partner die. So when Jack put in his retirement papers, he had done the same for Rex. They had both given everything to the force. Now they were just two old soldiers, trying to forget. But Rex never forgot. Jack exhaled heavily, running a hand over his face as he blinked back to the present. The house was quiet again, but the memories still lingered, heavy as ever. He looked down at Rex, who was still awake, his head resting on his paws, his eyes reflecting something deep, something that went beyond instinct, beyond training. Grief. Jack swallowed, the weight in his chest pressing down harder. He had spent years trying to push the past away, but maybe Rex had been carrying it all along. And now, after all this time, something or someone had brought it back. Jack didn't know what it was yet, but one thing was certain. Rex had never forgotten that night, and neither had Jack. The night stretched endlessly over Rockford, Texas, the sky a vast expanse of darkness, interrupted only by faint starlight. A warm breeze whispered through the trees, rustling the dry leaves along the fence line. The sounds of the town had long since faded, leaving only the quiet hum of distant crickets and the occasional creak of old wood settling into the earth. Jack Callahan stood on the porch, his arms crossed, watching Rex with growing concern. The German shepherd had barely moved for the past hour, his body tense, ears flicking at every slight sound. His gaze remained fixed on a single spot at the far edge of the yard, near the back fence where the grass met the open field beyond. Jack exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. Something was off. Rex had always been perceptive, sharper than most people Jack had worked with. The dog had tracked down missing persons in storms, sniffed out drugs hidden in places no human could have suspected, and once even saved Jack from a knife-wielding suspect by reacting a split second before Jack could. If Rex was fixated on something, it wasn't without reason. Jack glanced around the yard, his instincts prickling. The place hadn't changed much since he bought it. A modest one-story house with weathered wooden siding, a yard large enough for Rex to run, and a porch that creaked under his weight when he leaned against it. It had been a retreat from the past, a place to disappear after he left the force. But lately, it felt as if the past was clawing its way back. Rex let out a soft huff, shifting slightly but still staring ahead. Jack pushed off the porch, his boots crunching against the dirt as he strode toward him. "All right, boy," he murmured. "Show me." Rex rose instantly, his movements slower than they used to be but still purposeful. His tail hung low, his ears pricked forward. He led Jack toward the fence, his nose twitching as if catching a scent only he could detect. Jack followed closely, his pulse steady but heightened, that old detective's intuition stirring in his gut. As they reached the far corner of the yard, Jack's gaze settled on a patch of disturbed soil. It wasn't immediately obvious. Someone who wasn't paying attention would have walked right past it. But to Jack, it stood out like a neon sign. The dirt was loose, darker, freshly turned. He crouched, running his fingers through it, feeling the dampness that came from being recently disturbed. His jaw tightened. Something or someone had dug here. Jack pulled out his utility knife, the handle worn smooth from years of use, and began carefully scraping away at the soil. The loose earth crumbled easily, and within seconds his fingers brushed against something solid. He dug deeper, heart pounding steadily as he unearthed the object, a strip of leather cracked with age. Jack frowned, his breath slowing. He pulled it free, shaking off the dirt. His fingers traced over the metal buckle, rusted from time. And then, His eyes landed on the engraved nameplate. Ryan. Jack froze. The world around him seemed to narrow, the night pressing in closer. He turned the collar over in his hands, as if expecting it to be something else, something insignificant. But there was no mistaking it. This was Ryan's old dog collar. Memories slammed into him like a freight train. Ryan had never owned a dog of his own, but when they worked together in K9, he had formed a bond with Rex. He had been the type of guy who would ruffle Rex's ears when no one was looking, who had slipped him treats when the handlers weren't paying attention. He had laughed when Rex would nudge his leg for attention, and once, after a long overnight stakeout, he had come back with this collar, a simple leather band with Ryan's name on it, a joke between them. "Every great cop needs a badge, even you, partner," Ryan had said, fastening the collar around Rex's neck. Rex had worn it off-duty for years, until one day after Ryan's death, it had simply vanished. Jack had assumed it had been lost during one of their transfers, another small piece of the past, swallowed by time, but it hadn't been lost. It had been buried, here, in his own backyard. Jack's grip tightened on the collar. He looked at Rex, who sat watching him, those deep brown eyes filled with something unspoken. Had Rex known it was here? Had he sensed it all this time? And why now, after all these years, had the dog suddenly started digging? Jack scanned the yard, his heartbeat steady but weighted. Someone had to have placed this here, recently. Or had it been here all along? His gut twisted at the thought. He had searched for this collar after Ryan died. He had gone through all their old gear, their lockers, every possible place it could have been. And yet, it had ended up here, beneath his fence, buried just deep enough to be forgotten. Jack swallowed hard. His detective instincts were screaming, every fibre of his being telling him that this wasn't a coincidence. Had someone been in his yard recently? Or had this been sitting here unnoticed all these years? Rex had never forgotten. And now, Jack had no choice but to remember. Was Rex sensing something connected to the past? The collar lay heavy in Jack's hands, its cracked leather and rusted buckle, carrying the weight of years he had tried to forget. The night air had grown colder, the stillness pressing against him, thick and unrelenting. He exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the dim glow of the porch light, but his thoughts were anything but clear. His grip on the old relic tightened as he tried to piece together the impossible. Had it been buried all this time, hidden beneath layers of dirt, or had someone recently placed it there? If so, who and why? Rex sat beside him, his head slightly lowered, his ears flicking in every direction. The dog was alert, more so than usual. Jack could feel it, the way Rex's muscles tensed, the way his tail remained still, stiff. Something was wrong. The night was too quiet. Jack turned toward the house, his boots crunching against the dry grass. He needed a drink, something to clear his head. He climbed the porch steps, casting one last glance at the fence line before stepping inside. He tossed the collar onto the kitchen table, then grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet. His hands were steady, but inside, the storm was already raging. Ryan's death, the buried collar, the strange figure on the security footage. It was all connected. Jack poured himself a drink, downing it in one long gulp, then leaned against the counter. He had spent 2 years trying to put Ryan's murder behind him, forcing himself to accept that the man who had killed his best friend had disappeared. The official story had been simple. Luis Ortega, a cartel enforcer, had fled to Mexico after the botched deal that took Ryan's life. Jack had wanted to hunt him down, but jurisdiction had tied his hands. And now? Now he wasn't so sure Ortega had ever left. Then suddenly, a noise outside. Jack froze. The sound was faint, but distinct. Footsteps. He turned his head slightly, listening. His years in law enforcement had trained him to separate normal background noise from something off. This was off. Rex lifted his head from the floor, his ears perked, his entire body going rigid. A low growl rumbled in his throat, the kind Jack had heard only in moments of real danger. Jack moved quickly, his instincts snapping into place. He set his glass down and reached for the Glock 19 he kept on the counter. The gun felt familiar in his grip, the cold metal grounding him. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need to. Years of training had taught him that darkness was an advantage if you knew how to use it. He moved toward the front window, pressing his back against the wall before peering through the gap in the curtain. His house was surrounded by a decent yard, but beyond the porch lights, shadows stretched thick and unbroken. The security cameras would show more. Jack took a slow step back, then another, making his way to the small monitor mounted on the wall in his office. He tapped a few keys, switching the feed to live view. And there he was. A man stood near the edge of his property, just beyond the reach of the porch lights. Tall, lean but strong, the kind of build that suggested a lifetime of running and fighting. His face was obscured by the grainy feed, but Jack didn't need a clear picture. He had seen that stance before, that presence. His blood ran cold. Luis Ortega. Jack's grip on the Glock tightened. The son of a bitch had never left. For years, the department had been sure Ortega had fled south, disappearing into the chaos of cartel networks, untouchable beyond the border. But they had been wrong, and Rex had known. Jack's stomach clenched as everything clicked into place. Rex hadn't just been acting strangely, he had been sensing Ortega's presence. The dog had caught the scent of a man he had tangled with before, a man he had attacked, injured, but failed to kill. Jack switched the camera angle, tracking Ortega's slow, deliberate movements. The man wasn't just passing through, he was watching. Jack exhaled slowly. He could go out there now, confront him. But that wasn't smart. Ortega wouldn't be alone. Men like him never were. He needed to know why Ortega was here. Jack tapped the keyboard, rolling back the last few nights of footage. His chest tightened when he saw it wasn't the first time Ortega had been lurking nearby. 3 nights ago, 2:47 a.m., Ortega standing at the end of the road. 2 nights ago, 3:15 a.m., closer, moving along the fence line. Last night, 3:30 a.m., standing in the exact same spot Rex had been watching. Jack cursed under his breath. Ortega hadn't just stumbled back into town. He had been planning something, watching, waiting. Jack's mind raced. Why now? Why, after 2 years of silence, had Ortega resurfaced? The buried collar, Rex's behavior, it all pointed to one thing. Ortega was looking for something. Jack had spent a lifetime tracking men like him. He knew how they operated. Ortega wasn't the type to act out of nostalgia. He was here for a reason. Jack switched back to the live feed. Ortega was still there, lingering, his stance casual but predatory. Then, without warning, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the darkness beyond the fence. Jack stared at the screen, his jaw tight. This wasn't over. He stepped away from the monitor, his mind already running through possibilities. The police wouldn't be much help, not with a case this cold. Ortega had slipped through the cracks before. If Jack went through official channels, the bastard would be gone before sunrise. No. This was his problem. Jack glanced down at Rex, who was still watching the door, his body taut with tension. Jack holstered his gun. They were in this together. Tomorrow he would start digging. He would find out why Ortega was here, and then he would end it. Because if Ortega thought he could just walk back into this town like a ghost from the past, he had made one fatal mistake. Jack wasn't the kind of man to let the past stay buried. The town of Rockford was asleep under the weight of another Texas night, the air thick with the scent of dry earth and distant pine. Jack Callahan sat in his dimly lit living room, his Glock 19 resting on the coffee table next to a half-drunk glass of whiskey. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall, but he wasn't at ease. He hadn't been since spotting Luis Ortega on his security feed. Jack had spent most of the day digging through old files, revisiting crime reports, and making calls to old contacts in law enforcement. Why had Ortega come back? The answer was painfully clear. He thought Jack had something he wanted, something worth risking his life for. Jack leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. He had arrested too many criminals in his time to be naive. Ortega hadn't just shown up on a whim. He had a plan, and Jack needed to be ready. Rex lay beside him, his ears twitching every so often, his breathing slow but alert. The German Shepherd, now older but still a fighter, had been watching the doors and windows like a sentry. The old instincts never faded. Jack reached down, scratching behind Rex's ear, the familiar texture of his fur grounding him. "Whatever happens, buddy," he murmured, "we finish this." The dog didn't move, but his tail gave a slow thump against the wooden floor. He understood. He always did. A shadow in the yard. The clock struck 2:47 a.m. when Jack's instinct snapped him awake. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but years of police work had trained his body to react to the slightest disturbance. He sat up, heart steady, ears straining against the silence. Something was off. Then Rex lifted his head, his ears erect, his body suddenly tense. A low, guttural growl rumbled from his throat. Jack's mind sharpened instantly. The yard. He grabbed his gun and moved swiftly, silently, toward the security monitor. His fingers flicked through the feeds until he saw it, a figure moving along the fence, not walking, sneaking. Jack's pulse remained steady, but his grip on the Glock tightened. Ortega. Jack moved toward the front door, keeping his body low, his steps calculated. He wasn't about to let the bastard get away this time. But before he could move, Rex shot forward. The dog's age may have slowed him down, but instinct overpowered pain, and within seconds Rex was at the back door, muscles coiled, eyes locked on the dark figure outside. Jack could feel it, the tension before the storm. Then the bastard made his move. The attack. Ortega jumped the fence, landing in Jack's yard with the quiet precision of a man who had done this before. He moved fast, heading toward the side of the house, toward Jack's office window. But he never made it. A snarl tore through the night, followed by the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the ground. Jack was already moving, sprinting toward the back door, his heart hammering against his ribs. The second he stepped onto the porch, he saw the scene unfold. Rex had slammed into Ortega mid-stride, knocking him onto his back. The criminal let out a pained grunt as he tried to shove the massive German Shepherd off him, but Rex was relentless. His jaws clamped onto Ortega's forearm, teeth sinking into flesh, refusing to let go. Jack raised his gun, stepping forward. "Don't move!" Ortega let out a curse, his face contorted in pain. He was older than before, but still dangerous. His lean, scarred frame spoke of years of survival in the underworld. Dark eyes burned with fury, his black hair now streaked with grey, his jaw set in determination. But for the first time, he looked afraid. "You trained that damn dog too well," Ortega spat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Jack's expression remained stone cold. "You should have run faster." Ortega suddenly kicked out, his boot catching Rex in the ribs. The dog yelped but held firm, his growl deepening. Jack's blood ran hot. "Don't do that. Again." His voice was calm but laced with lethal intent. Ortega froze, sweat trickling down his temple. He knew that tone. Jack didn't bluff. But just as Jack reached for his radio, Ortega acted. With a sudden, desperate move, he yanked a knife from his belt, swinging wildly toward Rex. Jack's instincts took over. One gunshot shattered the night. The bullet hit Ortega's shoulder, sending the knife clattering to the ground. The man howled in pain, clutching the wound as blood seeped through his jacket. Rex finally released his grip, stepping back, panting but ready. Jack wasted no time. He kicked the knife out of reach, pressing a knee into Ortega's back as he pulled out his cuffs. "You're done." Ortega groaned, his face pressed against the dirt. "You don't even know what's coming." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Then you better start talking." Justice, after all these years. The sound of sirens filled the air, red and blue lights reflecting off the trees. Jack had called it in the second he fired the shot, knowing backup was necessary. The Rockford PD wasn't large, but they still took calls from a former detective seriously. 2 squad cars pulled up within minutes, the officers spilling out, their faces tense but focused. Leading them was Sergeant Ray Holloway, a man in his late 40s with a build like a linebacker and a no-nonsense attitude. His uniform was crisp, his stance solid, and his sharp hazel eyes scanned the scene before landing on Jack. "Callahan." Holloway's voice was gravelly, his gaze flicking between Jack, the bleeding man on the ground, and Rex, who stood tall despite his age. "You got some explaining to do." Jack scoffed, stepping back to let the officers cuff Ortega. "You're looking at the guy who murdered Ryan Carter." Holloway's expression shifted. Understanding, recognition, justice. He let out a slow breath, nodding. "Damn." He turned to his men. "Get him in the car, read him his rights." As the officers lifted Ortega to his feet, the criminal locked eyes with Jack one last time. There was no anger there, just cold calculation. "This isn't over," he muttered, before being shoved into the squad car. Jack watched the car disappear down the road, his hands still clenched into fists. Maybe Ortega was right. Maybe this wasn't over. But for now, Ryan finally had justice. A warm weight pressed against his leg. Rex. Jack looked down at his old partner, whose tail wagged once, his body tired but still standing strong. Jack knelt, running a hand through Rex's fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his palm. "You did good, buddy." Rex let out a soft chuff, nudging Jack's hand with his nose. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt at peace. The early morning light filtered through the trees, casting long golden shadows across Jack Callahan's yard. The echoes of sirens had faded, leaving behind a deep, resounding silence. The tension that had gripped him for the past few days was finally starting to lift, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed down on his chest. Luis Ortega was in custody. After years of evading the law, the man who had murdered Ryan was finally going to face justice. Jack stood on the porch, a steaming cup of black coffee in his hand, watching as Rex lay curled up near the steps. The German shepherd was exhausted. His fur was still slightly ruffled from the night's struggle, and his breathing was deep, steady, but heavy. Jack could see the subtle signs of age catching up to him, the slight tremble in his legs when he stood, the way he shifted his weight to ease his joints. But despite everything, Rex had done what no one else could. Jack took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth seep into his bones. He thought back to the night before, the way Rex had sensed Ortega before anyone else, the way he had lunged without hesitation to protect his home, his partner. Jack had trusted the dog's instincts his entire career, but this had been something deeper. Rex hadn't just been acting strangely out of old age or trauma. He had been trying to warn Jack about a very real threat. The realization left Jack with a lump in his throat. He had misread Rex's grief, thinking the dog had been lost in memories of Ryan. But no, Rex had known. He had recognized a scent, a presence from the past, and he had stayed alert, watching, waiting, until the moment came to act. Jack knelt beside him, running a hand through his fur. "You knew all along, didn't you, buddy?" he murmured. Rex's ears twitched slightly, but he didn't open his eyes. He was too tired, too spent. He had earned his rest. The official report. By mid-morning, Jack was at the Rockford Police Department, sitting across from Sergeant Ray Holloway in the cramped, paper-filled office. Holloway, a thick-built man in his late 40s, was the kind of cop who had seen it all. His short, greying hair and deep-set hazel eyes carried the exhaustion of years on the force. He had a no-nonsense demeanor, but beneath it, there was a deep respect for men like Jack, men who had been through hell and still stood tall. Holloway let out a slow exhale, flipping through a case file thick with years of dead-end leads. "So let me get this straight," he said, rubbing his temple. "Ortega never left town. We all thought he'd skipped the border, but he's been here the whole damn time." Jack nodded. "Hiding in plain sight. Probably moving between safe houses, keeping low. He must have known someone was looking for him, so he stayed quiet." Holloway grunted. Until he wasn't quiet anymore. He glanced at Jack, his eyes narrowing. What changed? Why now? Jack leaned back in the chair, folding his arms across his chest. That's the part that doesn't sit right with me. If he was just hiding, he wouldn't have risked coming near my place. He thought I had something he needed. Holloway frowned. Any idea what? Jack shook his head. No, but I'll find out. Holloway studied him for a long moment before closing the file. I should be telling you to leave this to the department. Jack smirked. Yeah, you should. Holloway sighed, rubbing his face. You always were a stubborn bastard. Jack's grin faded. I just want this finished, Ray. Holloway nodded. So do I. He glanced toward the holding cells. Ortega's looking at life without parole. The DA's already working on the charges. The guy's past is finally catching up to him. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of closure. Ryan would never come back, but at least now his killer wouldn't walk free. Answers in the silence. That evening, Jack sat on the porch again, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The air smelled of warm dirt and the faint scent of pine. It was peaceful, the kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. Rex stirred beside him, stretching out his legs before shifting closer to Jack's chair. He still moved with a slight stiffness, but there was an ease in his posture now, the weight of something finally lifted. Jack reached down, absently running a hand along Rex's back. You never gave up, did you? His voice was quiet, thoughtful. Rex let out a soft huff, his tail thumping weakly against the wooden boards. Jack thought back to the buried collar, the restless nights, the way Rex had refused to eat, sitting at the fence like a sentry. He had been trying to tell Jack something from the start. It had just taken Jack too long to listen. He sighed. I should have trusted you sooner. Rex lifted his head slightly, his deep brown eyes meeting Jack's. There was no accusation there, no disappointment, just the quiet understanding of a companion who had always known the truth before his human had. Jack exhaled, leaning back. The town was quiet tonight. No shadows lurking beyond the fence, no threats in the dark. For the first time in years, it felt like home again. Jack ran a hand through his greying hair, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Guess we make a pretty damn good team, huh? Rex's tail thumped again, just once, a confirmation. Jack took a slow sip of his whiskey, letting the warmth settle deep in his chest. The past would never fully let go of him. He knew that much. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. Justice had been restored, and Rex had done what no one else could. He had brought the past to light, and in doing so, he had finally given Jack and himself peace. The world had settled into a quieter rhythm in the days following Ortega's arrest. The lingering tension that had hung over Jack Callahan's home, his thoughts, and his very existence had begun to fade, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Justice had been served. Ryan's killer was behind bars, and Rex, his ever-loyal partner, had proven once again that time had not dulled his instincts. Jack sat on his porch, a cup of coffee resting on the arm of his chair, watching Rex stretched out under the shade of the oak tree in the yard. The German shepherd, though still powerful, moved a little slower these days. The battle scars of time were etched into his greying coat, the slight stiffness in his joints a reminder that he had given everything to Jack, to the force, to the life they had lived together. For the first time in weeks, Rex was eating again. His appetite had returned. His movements, though still careful, held a sense of ease that hadn't been there before. It was as if the weight he had been carrying had finally been lifted. Jack knew the truth. Rex had been fighting for something, fighting against time, against the ghosts of the past, against the unspoken fear that had kept him on edge. Now, with Ortega locked away, it was as if he had given himself permission to rest, but Jack wasn't ready to lose him yet. A promise for the time left. As the days passed, Jack made a decision. He wasn't going to sit around waiting for time to take Rex from him. He would make every single moment count. Each morning, before the Texas heat settled in, Jack would take Rex out for a walk along the wooded trails outside of town. The dog might not have had the energy to chase after birds or run ahead like he used to, but he still lifted his nose to the wind, still moved with the quiet grace of an old soldier. Jack would talk to him as they walked, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about Ryan, sometimes about the future neither of them could predict. In the afternoons, Jack tossed an old tennis ball across the yard, not expecting Rex to chase it like he used to, but the dog still humored him, trotting over, picking it up between his teeth and dropping it back at Jack's feet with a look that said, "I've still got it." And in the evenings, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon, the sky painted in streaks of gold and purple. Jack would sip his whiskey, and Rex would let out a long, contented sigh, resting his head against Jack's boot. Jack had spent his whole life chasing criminals, living on the edge of danger. But here, with Rex beside him, in the stillness of their quiet life, he finally understood what it meant to just be. The shelter visit. It was on a particularly warm afternoon that Jack found himself standing outside the Rockford Animal Shelter, staring at the faded sign above the entrance. It wasn't a place he had ever paid much attention to before, but today something had drawn him here. Rex stood beside him, panting lightly, his tail swishing lazily against Jack's leg. He wasn't sure if the old dog understood why they were here, but he didn't question it. He just watched as Jack pulled open the door and stepped inside. The shelter was small but well kept, the smell of fresh bedding and disinfectant mingling in the air. A woman behind the front desk looked up from her paperwork, offering Jack a warm but curious smile. She was in her early 50s, with short-cropped silver hair and kind brown eyes. Margaret Maggie Lawson, according to her name tag. She had the air of someone who had spent years caring for others, both human and animal alike. "Afternoon," she greeted, setting down her pen. "What can I do for you?" Jack glanced around, feeling oddly out of place. "Not sure yet," he admitted. "Just looking." Maggie's gaze fell to Rex, her smile softening. "He's a handsome one. Retired working dog?" Jack nodded. "Yeah, best partner I ever had." Maggie's eyes flickered with understanding. "They never really stop being our partners, do they?" Jack chuckled. No, they don't." She leaned on the counter. "So you thinking about getting him a little company?" Jack hesitated, glancing down at Rex, who was sniffing the air, his tail flicking just slightly in interest. Maggie studied them both for a moment before motioning toward the back. "I think I have someone you should meet." Jack followed her past the rows of kennels, Rex padding along beside him. The shelter was filled with dogs of all shapes and sizes, some barking eagerly, some curled up in the corners of their enclosures. But it wasn't until they reached the last kennel that Maggie stopped. Inside was a small golden-furred puppy, no more than a few months old. He had wide, curious eyes and slightly oversized paws, the kind that hinted he would grow into a strong, sturdy dog someday. He sat, watching them, his tail wagging uncertainly, as if he wasn't sure whether to be excited or cautious. "He was found abandoned outside town," Maggie explained, crouching near the kennel. No collar, no microchip, probably a stray. Jack studied the puppy, his big, expressive eyes full of life. There was something in him, something familiar. Rex stepped forward, sniffing through the bars. The puppy hesitated, then cautiously pressed his tiny nose against Rex's, letting out a soft, uncertain whimper. Jack smiled, something warm settling in his chest. Rex's tail gave a single, slow wag. That was all the confirmation Jack needed. A new beginning. The ride home was quieter than Jack expected. The little pup sat in the passenger seat, his paws tucked under his body, his ears twitching at every new sound. Rex lay in the back, watching the pup with mild curiosity but without complaint. Jack kept glancing over, shaking his head with a smirk. "What the hell am I going to do with two of you?" The puppy just blinked at him, letting out a tiny yawn. Back at the house, Rex led the way inside, settling into his usual spot on the porch. The puppy hesitated at the doorway, looking between Jack and Rex, as if waiting for permission. Jack knelt, patting the floor beside him. "Come on, kid, you're home now." The puppy trotted forward, his little paws tapping against the wooden floor. He paused near Rex, giving the older dog a tentative sniff before curling up beside him. Jack exhaled, leaning back. This was it, a new beginning, a new chapter. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking back. He was moving forward, with Rex. And now, with a little life that needed him, just as much as he needed it. The past would always be a part of him. But today was about something else, hope, and Jack was ready to embrace it. In the biting cold of an empty alley, a dog lay still, his body weak, his spirit nearly broken. No name, no home, just another discarded life, until a boy's voice cut through the silence. "I'll take him." No one believed the bond could work. No one saw the connection forming between a forgotten soldier and a child with wounds of his own. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. No, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment and be part of this journey with us. May this story bring warmth to your heart. Now let's begin. The Montana Agricultural Fair was in full swing, a lively blend of dust, chatter, and the scent of livestock. Vendors shouted over the hum of the crowd, selling everything from leather saddles to hand-carved wooden toys. The auction grounds, however, were a different world, one of cold assessments and transactions, where the worth of an animal was measured in dollars and utility. At the farthest corner of the auction area, hidden in the shadows of sturdier, well-fed working dogs, a lone bloodhound lay curled up in a rusted metal cage. The dog was large, but painfully thin, his rust-red coat dulled by neglect, with small patches of fur missing around his ribs and legs. He was not aggressive, not snarling or growling, just tired. His long, droopy ears framed a solemn face, and his dark amber eyes barely lifted to meet the sea of passing boots and voices. A laminated paper had been carelessly pinned to the crate. Lot 47, former search and rescue canine, decommissioned due to injury and behavioral concerns. A handful of people stopped to glance at him, but none lingered. He was not the kind of dog that fetched high bids, not like the sleek hunting retrievers or the sharp-eyed herding dogs that would bring in good money for the ranchers. A broad-chested auctioneer with a weathered cowboy hat and a voice like rolling thunder finally stepped onto the platform. He held his microphone like a weapon, scanning the crowd as he flipped through his auction notes. "All right, folks, up next, Lot 47. He paused, shifting his weight as if debating how much effort he should put into selling a dog no one wanted. Purebred bloodhound, trained for search and rescue, good working stock. Bidding starts at $50. Silence. A middle-aged rancher in a brown vest snorted, crossing his arms. "Ain't no good if he's been decommissioned." "Too skinny," another man muttered, adjusting his belt. "Ain't got the strength left to track a raccoon, let alone a missing person." A younger man chuckled. $50? You'd have to pay me to take him." The bloodhound remained motionless, his heavy head resting on his front paws. He had heard these dismissals before. The auctioneer, clearly eager to move on, raised an eyebrow. "No takers? I'll drop it to 25. Then a voice rang out, small but firm. "I'll take him." Heads turned. The voice belonged to a boy, no more than 10 years old, standing near the back. He wasn't tall for his age, his frame wiry but strong, hazel eyes burning with quiet determination. His brown curls peeked from beneath a faded baseball cap, one that had clearly been worn for years, fraying at the edges. Levi Parker clutched his numbered auction paddle tightly, his knuckles white. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "That kid serious? He wouldn't last a day with that mutt." At Levi's side stood a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 60s. The years sat heavily on his frame, his square jaw shadowed by silver stubble, his once black hair now completely grey. But there was still power in his stance, the kind of presence that made people straighten their backs when he walked by. Howard Parker had spent 30 years in law enforcement, and it showed. He had the wary eyes of a man who had seen too much, the stiff shoulders of someone who never truly relaxed, even in retirement. A lifetime of chasing criminals had given him a deep mistrust of lost causes, and that dog, in his mind, was a lost cause. He rested a firm hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Levi." His voice was low, steady. "That dog's broken." Levi didn't waver. His gaze never left the bloodhound. "He's not broken," the boy murmured. "He's just waiting for someone to believe in him." Howard let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening briefly before releasing the boy's shoulder. Levi had always been stubborn, too stubborn for a boy who had already learned what loss felt like. Levi swallowed, then reached into his jeans pocket and pulled out a bundle of crumpled bills. "I have $200, he said, voice steady despite the rapid beat of his heart. "My birthday money." The auctioneer hesitated, scanning the crowd one last time. No one else bid. "Sold to number 26. Levi exhaled in relief, clutching the paddle to his chest. Howard pinched the bridge of his nose, sighing. This was going to be a mistake. A dog like that needed patience, training, maybe even a vet that cost more money than Levi understood. But when Howard looked down at his grandson, saw the way he stood unshaken by the crowd's judgment, he knew there was no point in arguing. The kid had made up his mind. The auction worker, a burly teenager with a dusty apron, unlocked the cage and grabbed the bloodhound's leash. The dog didn't resist. He simply stood, slowly, with stiff, aching limbs, and allowed himself to be led forward. Levi knelt, holding out a cautious hand. The bloodhound sniffed it briefly before lowering his heavy head against the boy's palm. Something in Howard's chest tightened. He had seen that look before, not on a dog, but on people. People who had been abandoned. People who had stopped hoping until someone reminded them they were worth saving. Howard rubbed a hand down his face and exhaled deeply. As Levi looped the leash around his wrist, Howard fell into step beside him, boots scuffing against the wooden planks. Maybe, just maybe, this dog needed a second chance as much as Levi did. The journey home was quieter than Levi had expected. He had imagined something different. Maybe the bloodhound wagging his tail, maybe some moment of unspoken understanding where the dog would press his nose into Levi's hand, acknowledging their new bond. Instead, Rust, no, not Rust yet, just sat in the back of the truck, pressed into the furthest corner as if trying to disappear. The old Ford rattled along the dirt road, the afternoon sun casting long shadows over the endless Montana plains. Howard, gripping the wheel with one hand, glanced at the rear-view mirror every so often, his brows furrowed in thought. "You know," Howard finally spoke, his voice cutting through the silence, "dogs like that don't just bounce back overnight." Levi, sitting with his arms wrapped around his knees, didn't respond right away. His eyes were locked on the dog's unmoving frame. "I know," the boy finally whispered. Howard sighed, his fingers tapping against the wheel. "It's not just the injury that got him retired. That kind of fear doesn't come from nothing." Levi turned to his grandfather. "What do you think happened to him?" Howard exhaled deeply, adjusting his worn-out hat before speaking. "Dogs like him go through a lot. Search and rescue isn't easy work. Some get hurt, some get lost, and some see things that change them." He gave Levi a sidelong glance. "Kinda like people." Levi didn't ask more. The rest of the drive passed in silence, the only sound the occasional gust of wind rustling through the cracked windows and the faint hum of the truck's engine. Home, but not yet safe. The Parker Ranch wasn't large, but it was old, built with the kind of care that made things last. A small, weathered house stood at the center of the property, its white paint peeling in places but still sturdy. A barn, faded red and smelling of hay and aged wood, stood behind it, flanked by wide, open fields where a handful of cattle grazed lazily. The truck rolled to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dust as Howard shifted into park. Levi jumped out first, holding the leash loosely in his hand. But the bloodhound didn't move. He stayed where he was, his large amber eyes flicking between Levi and the open space beyond the truck. His muscles were tense, coiled like a spring, as if expecting something bad to happen. Howard watched from the driver's seat. Let him come out on his own. Levi nodded, stepping back, giving the dog space. After a long pause, the bloodhound slowly moved, first lowering one large paw to the truck bed, then another. His legs trembled slightly as he climbed down, his movements slow and deliberate. The second his paws hit the dirt, he flinched. His ears pulled back, his tail tucked tightly under his belly. Levi's heart ached. What had they done to him to make him so afraid of freedom? "Easy, boy," Levi murmured, keeping his voice soft. He crouched slightly, holding out his hand, not expecting anything, just offering. The bloodhound didn't come closer, but he didn't pull away either. That was enough for now. A name for a lost soul. That night, Levi sat cross-legged on the wooden porch steps, a worn-out notebook open on his lap. The bloodhound lay a few feet away, curled against the side of the house, head resting on his paws. He wasn't inside the house, despite Levi's coaxing. He had bolted the second the front door had opened, his instincts screaming for escape. Howard had said to give him time. Levi could be patient. Flipping through the notebook, Levi glanced at the scrawled-out names. Rusty, Copper, Red, Bruno, Duke. None of them felt right. His gaze flicked to the dog. The moonlight caught on the dull reddish-brown of his coat. It wasn't the rich mahogany of a young bloodhound, nor the deep chestnut of a well-cared-for one. It was faded, uneven, streaked like old metal left out in the rain, like rust. Levi tapped his pencil against the page, then slowly wrote the name out. Rust. It fit. Closing the notebook, Levi whispered, "Rust." The dog didn't react, not yet, but Levi would make sure that one day the name would mean something to him. Broken trust. Over the next few days, Rust kept his distance. He didn't eat much, didn't bark, didn't make a sound. He just watched. Watched Levi, watched Howard, watched the open fields as if waiting for something or someone to come and take him away. He refused to step inside the house. Levi left the door open sometimes, hoping, but Rust would pace near the threshold, nostrils flaring, then retreat to his corner of the porch. Howard had seen it before. A dog that had been hurt didn't trust easily. One evening after Levi had gone to bed, Howard sat on the porch, a cup of black coffee steaming in his hand. Rust lay curled up nearby, pretending not to notice him. Howard took a slow sip before speaking. "You're not the first to be scared of something, boy." His voice was low, thoughtful. "We all got things we're running from." Rust's ear flicked. Howard sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I won't lie to you. You stay like this, you won't make it. A scared dog's got no place in this world." Rust didn't move. Howard leaned forward slightly. "But my grandson believes in you. So maybe you ought to start believing in yourself." The bloodhound shifted, eyes flicking toward Howard for just a moment. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The first step. The real breakthrough came unexpectedly. It was a cold morning, mist hanging low over the fields. Levi had been up early, setting out a fresh bowl of food and water on the porch before heading off to help with the cattle. When he returned, he nearly tripped over something by the door. The food bowl, half empty. Rust, lying nearby, pretended he didn't care. Levi didn't say anything, didn't make a big deal out of it. He just smiled, quietly refilled the bowl, and sat down beside him. For the first time, Rust didn't flinch when Levi's hand rested gently against his back. It wasn't trust yet, but it was something, and that meant everything. The first real break in Rust's behavior came on a crisp autumn evening when the wind whispered through the tall grasses on the outskirts of the ranch. The sun had just dipped behind the horizon, leaving a soft glow over the open fields. Levi sat on the porch, quietly watching the shadows stretch across the land, the deep orange sky slowly fading to twilight. He glanced over at Rust, who was lying in his usual spot near the barn, his eyes unblinking as he stared out into the darkening world. Rust's demeanor had changed, but only slightly. There were days when the dog would wander the yard aimlessly, but there were still moments when he would retreat into a corner, stiff with fear at the slightest noise. Levi noticed it most when the wind picked up, or when the distant sound of traffic reached their ranch. Each time, Rust would freeze, his ears flicking, eyes wide and alert, as though a memory, an image from a time long before Levi had met him, was crashing into his mind. The boy hadn't told anyone yet about his own fears, the ones that clung to him like shadows, always lurking, but never quite visible in the daylight. Levi knew what it felt like to be abandoned, to feel lost in a world that moved on without you. He knew the sting of empty promises, the way things were supposed to be, but never quite turned out to be. He was hoping that in some way his presence might help Rust. Perhaps if they could understand each other, if they could find a way to connect, Rust might find the courage to face whatever it was that had made him this way. It wasn't just a physical scar, Levi was beginning to realize. This was deeper than that. A dog with no name. It was a Saturday afternoon when the next breakthrough came. Howard had gone into town for supplies, leaving Levi and Rust alone on the ranch. Levi was busy with a simple task, gathering firewood. His movements were slow, deliberate. He didn't want to scare the dog off, didn't want to overwhelm him. Rust had become more familiar with Levi's presence, but still there was distance between them. The dog would come close, his massive form hovering just out of reach, and then with a sudden jerk, he'd pull away. Sarah, the woman who lived down the road and came to help on the ranch during harvest, had come by that afternoon. Levi had met Sarah a few weeks ago. She was a woman in her early 30s, tall and sturdy with short brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. Her hands, calloused from years of work on her own farm, were always busy, but her eyes held a kindness that Levi had noticed from the first moment they met. She was the first person to truly speak to him about his own family, about his mother's death, about the estrangement from his father. She didn't ask him to talk about it, didn't push. She just offered a warm presence, her quiet company a balm to his often painful loneliness. Sarah had become an unexpected ally to both Levi and Rust. "You got him eating?" she asked as she approached Levi, wiping her brow from the dust in the air. Her voice had a softness to it, tempered by years of practical experience. She was the kind of person who didn't waste words, but when she spoke, her words meant something. "Not much," Levi muttered, glancing over at Rust, who was watching them from the edge of the yard. "I don't think he trusts me." Sarah looked down at the dog, then back at Levi. "It's not about trust right now. Not yet. It's about giving him time." She knelt down and started gathering a few scattered sticks that had fallen from the trees around the property. Levi frowned, his brow furrowing with worry. "I don't know how long he can take this. I don't know how much longer I can keep trying." "Trying is all you can do. Just don't give up." Sarah gave him a small smile, one that seemed to reassure Levi in a way nothing else had. She paused, then glanced at the dog again, this time with a softer gaze. Maybe he needs something more than just food. Maybe he needs someone who understands, someone who doesn't ask anything from him. Levi nodded, feeling the weight of her words in his chest. Rust was not a simple problem to solve, and Levi realized he might not be the only one who had been broken by something. Facing the past. That night, as the wind howled outside, Levi sat by the fire with Rust lying on the rug in front of him. The old wood floors creaked beneath his feet as Levi shifted on the couch, unsure of how to break the silence. Finally he spoke, his voice soft. "You know, I think I get it." Rust's head lifted slightly, his eyes catching the firelight. He stared at Levi but didn't move. Levi could see the weariness in those eyes, the battle between wanting to trust and being too scared to. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Levi continued. "I know what that's like, you know. to lose people you love, to have no one left but yourself. I don't want you to feel that way anymore. You don't have to be alone." Rust's tail twitched slightly, then tucked back under his body, a small, instinctive gesture Levi had seen time and time again. The dog was still afraid of something buried too deep to be reached. Levi leaned forward, his eyes locked on the dog. "I'm not going to leave you. I'll stay with you until you're ready. You're not alone anymore, Rust." The words were small, but Levi knew they were important. He'd made the same promise to himself years ago when his own family had been torn apart by tragedy. He knew what it meant to feel like a piece of you was missing, to have nothing but ghosts around you. But he had to believe that he could help Rust, just like he had to believe he could help himself. The wounds inside. As the days went on, Rust started to show small signs of improvement. He ate a little more, though still not with the same enthusiasm that Levi had hoped for. Sometimes Rust would follow Levi around the yard, his eyes scanning the horizon, his steps hesitant but sure. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, Levi would wake to find Rust standing at the window, staring out at the empty fields, his body rigid with fear. It was as if the dog was waiting for something, waiting for the nightmares of his past to catch up with him. Levi didn't know what to do about the nightmares, the sound of a car engine, the sharp whine of a siren, the unmistakable echo of loud footsteps. Every loud sound would make Rust flinch, his whole body shaking, his breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. Each time Levi would gently place a hand on his back, whispering the same words, "It's okay, Rust. You're safe now." But Levi knew that safety wasn't something that could be given to a dog like Rust. It had to be earned piece by piece, one small act of trust at a time. It was a quiet afternoon on the ranch, the kind where the golden light stretched across the fields, painting everything in hues of amber and rust. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant pine trees, and the occasional sound of livestock drifted from a neighboring farm. Howard had just finished his usual rounds, checking the fences, making sure the barn was secured for the night, when something caught his eye. Rust had been lying near the porch, his large frame curled into a tight ball, his nose tucked beneath his tail. Though he had begun to trust them more, there were still moments when he seemed lost in thought, his eyes distant, as if watching a world only he could see. Howard had never been one to pry, but there was something about the way Rust carried himself that had always unsettled him. The dog was too disciplined, too trained to have been just another abandoned mutt. And then there was the old, worn leather collar around Rust's neck. Howard had never paid much attention to it before, assuming it was just another remnant of Rust's past life, but that day something about it caught his attention. A hidden message. Howard knelt beside Rust, his fingers brushing over the collar's frayed edges. It was sturdy but well worn, the kind of collar that had seen years of service. As he adjusted it, his fingers grazed something stiff tucked inside the lining. Frowning, he carefully pulled at the seam, and to his surprise, a small folded slip of paper slipped out. Howard unfolded it slowly, his experienced hands steady despite the twinge of curiosity tightening in his chest. On the yellowed, creased paper, a string of numbers was scrawled in black ink. K9 Unit 7634B Rust. His breath hitched slightly. A registration number. This wasn't just any stray dog. Rust had once belonged to an official unit. Howard's eyes darkened with thought. He had spent over 30 years in law enforcement before retiring, and if there was one thing he knew, it was that a number like this wasn't random. Rust had been part of something bigger, maybe a police force or even a military unit. But what had happened? Why had he been abandoned? With a deep sigh, Howard folded the note carefully and slid it into his shirt pocket. He needed answers, and there was only one person he trusted enough to help him get them. An old friend. That evening, after Levi had gone to bed, Howard sat in his study, an old rotary phone resting on the wooden desk in front of him. The room smelled of aged books and the faint scent of pipe tobacco from years past. The study was one of the few places where Howard allowed himself to dwell in old memories. The walls were lined with photos, some of his late wife, others of his days on the force. He exhaled slowly, then dialed a number he hadn't used in years. After a few rings, a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Who the hell is calling me this late?" Howard smirked. "Still as grumpy as ever, aren't you, Mike?" There was a pause, then a chuckle. "Howard, damn, it's been years. You finally decide to come out of retirement and clean up this town?" "Not a chance," Howard replied, leaning back in his chair. "I need a favor." Mike Holloway had been one of Howard's closest friends in the force, a no-nonsense detective with a talent for digging up information that others couldn't. Mike had spent the last few years working as a private investigator after retiring from the police force. If anyone could find out what happened to Rust, it was him. Howard explained everything: the dog, the collar, the registration number. He could hear Mike scribbling something down on the other end of the line. "I'll see what I can find," Mike said. "But if this dog belonged to the K9 unit, you might not like what I dig up." Howard's grip tightened on the phone. "I just need to know what happened." "All right," Mike sighed. "Give me a day or two. I'll get back to you." Howard hung up and sat in the dim light of his study, the weight of uncertainty settling over him. Rust wasn't just any dog, and whatever past he carried, Howard knew it was something serious. Levi's discovery. While Howard was uncovering Rust's past, Levi was making his own discovery. Ever since bringing Rust home, he had spent every moment trying to connect with him. But the dog remained distant, watching the world through wary eyes, reluctant to let his guard down. One afternoon, Levi decided to try something new. He had read once that dogs, especially trained ones, responded to play, to games that activated their instincts. So he gathered a handful of small objects, his baseball cap, a glove, a rolled-up scarf, and set them in the field behind the house. "All right, Rust," Levi said, stepping back. "Let's see if you can find them." Rust sat by the porch, his ears flicking slightly at Levi's voice but showing no real interest. Levi sighed. Maybe it was pointless. Maybe Rust wasn't. And then the dog moved. At first, it was just a shift in his stance. His body tensed, eyes narrowing as he watched Levi gesture toward the field. Then, without warning, Rust sprang to his feet, his nose twitching as he scanned the open space. Levi felt his breath catch. Something had clicked. He pointed toward the baseball cap. "Find it!" Rust hesitated only for a second before his head lowered, sniffing the air. Then, with smooth, practiced movements, he trotted toward the field, his body language shifting from wary to focused. Within seconds, he stopped, nose buried in the dirt, right where the cap was hidden. Levi stared, wide-eyed. "No way." Excited now, he pointed toward the glove. "Find it, Rust." Again, the dog responded instantly, moving with precision and efficiency. His hesitation, his fear, it was still there. But beneath it, there was something else. Training, instinct, memory. Rust wasn't just any dog. He had been trained to do this. Connecting the dots. Levi ran back inside, breathless. "Grandpa, you won't believe this." Howard turned from the sink, raising an eyebrow. "What's got you so worked up?" "Rust. He knows how to search for things, like really search for them. He found everything I hid in, like seconds." Howard's brow furrowed as he pulled out the slip of paper from his pocket. He glanced down at the numbers, then back at Levi. The pieces were starting to come together. Rust wasn't just a lost dog. He was something more. And now, the question was, who had left him behind? And why? Howard knew one thing for certain. Whatever answers they found, they would change everything. The golden light of late afternoon cast long shadows across the yard as Levi sat on the porch steps, absent-mindedly rubbing Rust's ear. The bloodhound had settled beside him, his deep brown eyes reflecting something distant, something lost. Levi could feel it. There was more to Rust than just a timid, abandoned dog. There was something inside him waiting to wake up. Howard stood near the truck, arms crossed, watching his grandson with quiet concern. It had been weeks since they brought Rust home, and though the dog had begun to trust them, his instincts remained sharp, his alertness never fading. Something about his past still clung to him like an unshakable shadow. Then the news broke. Howard had the radio playing low as he checked the tires on his truck, but Levi heard the change in the announcer's tone. He stood abruptly, his heart hammering. A missing child alert has been issued for a 5-year-old girl, last seen near the Eastern Forest Trail. Authorities have begun search efforts, but as night approaches, concerns grow for the child's safety in the dropping temperatures. Levi turned to Howard. "That's where we were this morning," he said, urgency creeping into his voice. Howard's eyes darkened. "Yeah, I know." Rust lifted his head, ears twitching. The dog's body tensed slightly as if he too sensed the weight of the situation. Levi grabbed his grandfather's arm. "Rust can help. Grandpa, you saw what he did with my stuff. He tracked it like it was nothing. What if he can do the same for the girl?" Howard hesitated. Years of experience told him that tracking a person, especially a child, was no easy feat. But then, Rust wasn't just any dog, and Levi believed in him. He exhaled slowly. "All right, we'll try, but we do this properly." Levi grinned. Rust, as if sensing the shift, wagged his tail once. Howard grabbed his keys. "Let's go." The decision at the search site. By the time they arrived at the search site, the forest was filled with the hum of anxious voices, flashing red and blue lights, cutting through the dimming sky. Officers moved in coordinated efforts, fanning out along the trailhead. Levi spotted a woman nearby, her face pale, her hands trembling. Her golden hair was unkempt, strands sticking to her damp cheeks. Sarah Monroe, the missing girl's mother. Sarah had always been the type of woman who exuded quiet resilience. A single mother, she worked long hours at the town's small diner to provide for her daughter Emily. But now, that resilience was crumbling. Her frantic gaze searched the growing darkness, her lips quivering with whispered prayers. An officer, Maria Delgado, one of the town's lead responders, stood beside her, speaking in a firm but calm tone. Delgado was in her late 30s, her dark brown hair pulled into a tight ponytail. She had the no-nonsense presence of someone who had seen too many of these cases before, yet her sharp brown eyes still held a flicker of determination. Howard approached her first. "Delgado." She turned, eyes narrowing slightly. "Howard, what are you doing here?" Howard gestured toward Rust. "The kid's got a hunch this dog might be able to help." Delgado frowned. "You sure about that?" Levi stepped forward. "I know he can. Please, just let us try." Delgado studied the boy, then looked at Rust. The bloodhound stood still, ears twitching, nostrils flaring slightly, as if already catching the scent of something in the wind. Sarah, overhearing the conversation, turned toward them. Her tired blue eyes locked onto Rust with a flicker of desperate hope. "Please," she said, her voice raw. "If he can do anything, please." Delgado nodded sharply. "All right, let's get him a scent sample." A few minutes later, a stuffed rabbit was brought from Sarah's car. The little toy had a missing eye, its fur worn down from years of love. Delgado handed it to Levi. "Make sure he gets a good whiff." Levi knelt beside Rust, holding the rabbit close to his nose. "Find her, Rust," he whispered. "You can do this." Rust inhaled deeply. His body stiffened, his head lifting slightly. Then, without hesitation, he turned and bolted toward the forest. Levi barely had time to react before Howard grabbed his arm. "Stay close. We follow him, but no running ahead. Got it?" Levi nodded, his heart pounding as they took off after Rust. The search had begun. The sky had darkened significantly, thick clouds rolling in like an ominous warning. The first droplets of rain splattered against the damp forest floor, quickly growing heavier. The air turned thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. But Rust remained unfazed. His nose to the ground, he weaved through the trees with unwavering determination. Levi struggled to keep up. his sneakers slipping on the slick undergrowth. His breath came in sharp gasps, but he refused to slow down. Emily was out here somewhere, alone, scared, and growing colder by the second. Howard, despite his age, moved with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades navigating difficult terrains. His flashlight cut through the darkness, casting long shadows between the trees. He had seen cases like this before. He knew how quickly time could run out for a lost child, especially in bad weather. "Levi, stay close," he called, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Rust suddenly came to a halt. His ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. Then, in a burst of motion, he veered to the left, barking sharply. Howard clenched his jaw. "He's found something." Levi didn't hesitate. He sprinted after Rust, his heart hammering in his chest. A faint cry in the darkness. The rain had picked up, a relentless downpour soaking through Levi's jacket. The wind howled through the trees, making every rustling branch sound like something lurking just beyond sight. Then a sound, faint, almost swallowed by the storm. A cry. Levi's stomach twisted. He skidded to a stop, holding his breath, straining his ears. There it was again, a weak, muffled sob. "Emily!" Levi shouted, his voice barely cutting through the wind. Rust barked, then charged forward. Levi followed without hesitation. And then he saw her. Emily Monroe, barely 5 years old, was curled up at the base of a massive fallen tree. Her tiny frame was soaked, her blonde curls plastered to her pale cheeks. She clutched her stuffed rabbit against her chest, shivering violently. Her wide, terrified eyes locked onto them as they approached. Levi dropped to his knees. "Emily, it's okay, we're here to help." The little girl whimpered, too cold and frightened to speak. Howard quickly pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around her trembling body. "We need to get her out of here, fast." But before they could move, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the trees. A predator in the shadows. Howard's hand went instinctively to his side, where his old service pistol was holstered beneath his jacket. He had carried it for years, mostly out of habit, but tonight he was glad for it. The growl came again, low and menacing. Levi's breath hitched as his gaze darted toward the shadows. A pair of yellow eyes gleamed between the trees. A wolf. It stepped forward, its matted grey fur bristling. It was thin, ribs showing through its coat, a desperate creature, hungry. Levi instinctively moved closer to Emily, shielding her with his small frame. Rust let out a low rumble, stepping in front of them. His tail stood stiff, his hackles raised. He wasn't a fighter, and Levi knew it. Rust had always been the one running from threats, not facing them. But tonight, he didn't back down. The wolf snarled, baring its teeth. It took another step forward, then another, the rain dripping from its soaked fur. Levi could feel Rust's body vibrating with tension. The bloodhound was scared, but he didn't move. "Easy, Rust," Howard murmured, slowly reaching for his weapon. Levi held his breath. Was Rust really going to stand his ground? The wolf crouched, muscles coiling. It was going to lunge. Howard acted first. The gunshot cracked through the night like thunder. The wolf yelped and sprang backward, vanishing into the darkness. The echoes of the shot faded, leaving only the sound of rain and Levi's racing heart. Howard exhaled, keeping the gun lowered but ready. That should keep it away. Rust remained rigid, his eyes locked on where the wolf had disappeared. Then, slowly, he turned back toward Levi, ears flicking back as if asking, "Did I do okay?" Levi threw his arms around the dog. "You were amazing." Rust let out a small huff, finally relaxing. Howard knelt down, checking on Emily. The little girl had buried her face in Levi's sleeve, still shivering, but no longer crying. "We need to get her back," Howard said. "Let's move." Levi stood, holding Emily close. Rust, his head held high for the first time since Levi had met him, led the way home. The morning after the rescue, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a crisp autumn air that carried the scent of wet earth and pine. The town of Willow Creek, usually quiet and slow-moving, was suddenly buzzing with murmurs of the previous night's events. The story of the lost girl, the boy who never gave up, and the dog that refused to abandon its purpose had spread like wildfire. By the time Levi and Howard arrived in town with Rust, people were already gathered near the general store, their voices overlapping in excited whispers. The moment Levi stepped onto the sidewalk, all eyes turned to him, and more importantly, to Rust. Rust, still slightly damp from the rain, walked beside Levi with an unusual confidence. His once cautious movements had gained a steadiness, his head held a little higher. Something had changed. He wasn't just a forgotten bloodhound anymore, he was a hero. A town's changing heart. Mrs. Callahan, the owner of the town's bakery, was the first to approach. She was a stout woman in her 60s, with warm brown eyes and a flour-dusted apron, always smelling of fresh bread and cinnamon. She had known Levi since he was a baby, often slipping him extra cookies when his mother used to bring him to the shop. "My stars, Levi," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "Is it true? Your dog saved that little girl?" Levi nodded, a little unsure of how to respond to all the sudden attention. Rust shifted beside him, his ears flicking at the sound of the woman's voice. Howard cleared his throat, stepping forward. Rust didn't just find her. He protected her. If he hadn't been there, that wolf could have... He trailed off, shaking his head. Let's just say things could have ended differently. A few townspeople murmured among themselves, exchanging glances. Tom Abernathy, the local mechanic, scratched his grizzled chin. "I'll be damned," he muttered, looking at Rust as if seeing him for the first time. "Didn't think that hound had it in him." Levi clenched his fists. He remembered all too well how people had laughed at him at the auction, whispering about how he had wasted his money on a dog no one wanted. But now they saw Rust for what he truly was. A call from the rescue team. Just as Levi was about to respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle made the gathered crowd turn. A white and red truck with the Willow Creek Search and Rescue emblem rolled to a stop in front of them. The driver stepped out, a tall man in his early 40s with sharp, calculating blue eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a thick navy jacket with the department's logo embroidered on the chest. Deputy Jake Holloway. Holloway had been in charge of the rescue efforts last night, but he and his team had been forced to retreat due to worsening weather. He was an efficient, no-nonsense type of man, one who rarely smiled but commanded respect. He had been in law enforcement for years before transitioning to search and rescue. He wasn't the type to waste words. "Here you found the girl," Holloway said, stepping forward. His gaze landed on Rust, sharp with interest. "More importantly, I hear it was your dog that did it." Levi swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Holloway crouched down, his movements careful as he studied Rust. The bloodhound's tail flicked uncertainly, but he didn't back away. "I've seen a lot of dogs trained for this kind of work," Holloway said. "Most of them don't have what it takes, but what he did out there, that's instinct. You can't teach that." Levi felt his chest swell with pride, but before he could respond, Holloway turned his attention to Howard. "We'd like to evaluate him," he said. "See if he's fit to officially rejoin search and rescue." Levi stiffened. "Wait, what?" Holloway straightened. "A dog with his tracking ability could save a lot of lives. It'd be a shame to let that go to waste." Howard glanced at Levi. His expression was unreadable, but Levi could see the conflict in his eyes. He knew how much Rust meant to Levi, but he also understood what this opportunity could mean for the dog. The crowd around them had fallen silent, waiting for Levi's response. Rust, as if sensing the shift in energy, pressed his wet nose against Levi's palm. Levi looked down at him, stroking the bloodhound's velvety ears. Could he really let Rust go? A boy's decision? For a long moment, Levi said nothing. Rust had been abandoned once before, treated like a tool that had outlived its usefulness. He had spent months afraid, unwanted, and yet when given the chance to turn away, he had chosen to stay. He had chosen Levi. Levi knelt beside his dog, holding Rust's face in his hands. The bloodhound's deep brown eyes gazed back at him, full of something Levi couldn't quite describe. He exhaled. "I don't think Rust needs a job," Levi said, turning back to Holloway. "I think he just needs a home." Silence. Then, to Levi's surprise, Holloway smiled. "Fair enough," he said, adjusting his jacket. "Doesn't change what he did. You've got a special dog there, kid." Levi grinned, ruffling Rust's fur. "Yeah, I know." The gathered crowd began to murmur again, voices now filled with admiration rather than skepticism. Even Tom Abernathy gave a slow nod of approval. Howard clapped a hand on Levi's shoulder. "Well said, kid." Mrs. Callahan wiped at her eyes with the edge of her apron. "Bless that dog's heart, and yours too, Levi." Rust let out a soft huff, as if finally at ease. For the first time in a long while he belonged. The evening sun cast long shadows across the farmhouse, painting the wooden walls in hues of gold and amber. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the lingering aroma of the stew that simmered on the stove. Inside, the house was warmer than usual, not just from the fire crackling in the hearth, but from something deeper, something unspoken yet profoundly felt. Levi sat cross-legged on the living room floor, tossing a worn-out tennis ball across the wooden floorboards. Rust, now far from the fearful, withdrawn creature he once was, leapt forward with surprising agility, his long ears flopping as he snatched the ball mid-air. Levi grinned as the bloodhound trotted back, tail wagging. "You're getting faster," Levi remarked, scratching behind Rust's ears. The dog let out a low, contented huff, dropping the ball at Levi's feet. Across the room, Howard sat in his usual recliner, reading the local newspaper. His silver hair was neatly combed back, his strong features softened by the warm glow of the lamp beside him. Howard had always been a man of few words, his emotions often hidden beneath layers of discipline built from years as a police officer. But lately, something in him had shifted. He still kept his distance in some ways, still grumbled about Levi leaving his boots in the hallway, still pretended not to care when Rust nudged his hand for attention, but Levi saw the changes. He saw it in the way Howard set an extra bowl of water out for Rust without being asked. He saw it in the way the old man's hand lingered a little longer on Rust's head whenever he thought no one was watching. Rust wasn't just a dog to them anymore, he was family. An unspoken understanding. Howard cleared his throat and folded the newspaper. "Boy, that dog's got more energy than I expected," he muttered, but there was no annoyance in his tone, only quiet amusement. Levi smirked. "Told you he just needed a chance." Howard exhaled sharply, like he was about to argue, but then he only nodded. Yeah, I suppose you did." Levi didn't say anything more. He knew how rare it was for Howard to admit when he was wrong. He also knew how much Rust had softened the old man, even if he would never admit it out loud. The warmth of the moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Levi looked up, slightly puzzled. They weren't expecting company. Howard got up, moving with the steady, deliberate steps of a man who had spent decades keeping his guard up. He opened the door to reveal a woman in her late 30s, her blonde hair tied back in a loose ponytail, her expression a mixture of relief and quiet curiosity. Margaret Walker. Levi recognized her immediately. She was the mother of the little girl Rust had saved. She was tall and slender, with tired eyes that held both gratitude and a weight that came from being a single mother. The past few days had clearly been exhausting for her. Yet she stood with quiet strength, a small smile on her lips. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Margaret said, her voice smooth yet tinged with hesitation. I wanted to come by and say thank you, properly." Howard stepped aside, nodding toward the living room. "Come on in." Margaret stepped inside, her eyes immediately landing on Rust. The bloodhound sat beside Levi, his tail wagging slightly, his gaze calm but alert. She knelt down, extending a careful hand. "Hey there, Rust," she murmured. Rust sniffed her fingers before gently pressing his nose into her palm. Margaret looked up at Levi. "I heard about what you did. about how you never gave up on him." She smiled, genuine and warm. "You saved my little girl because of that." Levi's cheeks flushed slightly, but he only shrugged. "It was Rust," he said. "He's the real hero." Margaret's gaze softened. "That may be true, but he wouldn't have been there if it weren't for you." A night of change. They spent the next hour talking about Rust, about the rescue, about how Margaret's daughter was doing. She had been recovering well, though still a little shaken. Margaret admitted that the thought of losing her had been unbearable. Howard listened in silence, nodding occasionally. Levi noticed how the old man's usual tough exterior softened as he spoke with Margaret. Maybe it was because he understood what it meant to lose someone. Maybe it was because for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done something truly meaningful. When Margaret finally stood to leave, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. She handed it to Levi. "This is for you," she said. "It's not much, just a little something from the town. Everyone pitched in." Levi blinked, confused, before opening the envelope. Inside was a check, money collected from the townspeople as a thank you for what he and Rust had done. His hands trembled slightly as he looked up at Margaret. I don't know if I can take this." Margaret smiled knowingly. "It's not just for you. It's for Rust, too, to make sure he always has a home and everything he needs." Levi looked at Howard, unsure. Howard studied the check, then nodded once. "Take it," he said. "You earned it." Levi swallowed hard before nodding. "Thank you." Margaret gave one last glance at Rust before stepping onto the porch. "And thank you, Rust," she said softly, "for bringing my little girl back to me." Rust let out a small chuff as if he understood. A home at last. That night, as the fire crackled and the house settled into its usual quiet, Levi climbed into bed, his thoughts still spinning from the day's events. Rust stood at the doorway, watching. For months he had slept alone, always keeping a distance, always on alert. But tonight, Levi patted the empty space beside him. "Come on, Rust," he whispered. For a moment the bloodhound hesitated. Old habits were hard to break. Then, slowly, he padded forward, climbing onto the bed and curling up beside Levi. His body was warm, solid, safe. Levi ran a hand over his ears, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to keep watch anymore," he murmured. "You're home." Rust sighed, his body relaxing completely for the first time. And for the first time in his life, he truly believed it.